company focused on harnessing the power of the gut microbiome to improve human and animal health. Her entrepreneurial spirit and deep expertise have propelled Melius to the forefront of the field, developing innovative therapies for various health conditions. In today's talk, Dr. Gibson will share how the gut microbiome influences inflammation and brain health, and the impact of diet and live biotherapeutics like probiotics to support gut health. I would also like to take a moment to thank all our program donors for supporting the Brain Wellness Program. Because of your generosity, we can provide these accessible educational events and classes. As an entirely donor-funded program, we rely on your generosity to ensure the continuation and development of our program. So thank you for your ongoing support. Next, a couple housekeeping notes before we begin. If you have any questions for our presenter today, please leave them in the chat box. If you prefer to ask your questions privately, you can send them directly to me or Deanna or to the BC Brain Wellness, Cheng, one of our program assistants as well. We will have Q&A session at the end. Reminder to keep your mics muted throughout the talk to avoid disturbances, and we'll address your questions at the end. This presentation is being recorded and will be on the website, YouTube, within 2 weeks. In addition, we are actively recruiting for 2 research studies. For our Impact 360, we are recruiting for healthy agers and those with Parkinson's to understand the health impacts of a combined virtual exercise, cooking, and mindfulness class intervention. The contact is impact360@ubc.ca, which we'll put in the chat. So if there's anyone you know or it's relevant for you and you are interested in being part of it, please reach out. Furthermore, we have a new dietary intervention study to understand the impact of diet on symptoms and the microbiome of those with Parkinson's. Contact another email, which will be in the chat, pd.diet@ubc.ca. Please pass the message if you know someone who may be interested. It's really greatly appreciated. And these interventions are of no cost to you. So all the information is in the chat there. And without further ado, I will pass the mic to our speaker, Dr. Gibson. Welcome.
Thank you so much for inviting me to speak today about some of the work that I do at UBC. I'm just going to share my presentation. Oh, and okay, so I think everybody can see that now. I'm actually on the Okanagan campus, and that was a really beautiful and wonderful land acknowledgement, maybe one of the best I've heard, so I deeply appreciate that. We're on the Silks Okanagan campus, and if you don't know about it, it is a part of UBC, but it is a much younger version of UBC Vancouver. But nonetheless, we do have a lot of really interesting research that goes on here, and my lab has been here for 15 years. I was asked to discuss what is the gut microbiome and how does this relate to inflammation, and then get to brain health and wellness. And so I wanted to start with, really, aside from one of my teaching lectures, which is what is the immune system? And I'm sure you can all appreciate how important inflammation is. And often we hear in popular media that, inflammation can be damaging and maybe it's not our friend. But the reality is that we need inflammation to survive. It's a very important part of all of our physiological processes, arguably. And why it's so important is because it's this massive network of biological processes, and it is designed by Mother Nature to protect us from all sorts of diseases. And that does include infectious disease, of course, but it also detects and responds to cancer. And so it has this unique ability to decipher whether it's you or something else that looks a little bit weird. And cancer is you, but it looks a little bit weird. And so it has this wonderful ability to distinguish whether, it needs to attack something or it should not. And it is very amorphous, it's very diffuse, it's everywhere in the body. And that's actually one of the main reasons why inflammation connects with brain health. Is there's this ability to move with immune cells and also signal and communicate. So the immune system is fundamentally very, very important. But there are consequences when our inflammation or our immune system is dysfunctional. And that's what gets a lot of the press. So, for example, we understand that inflammation that isn't controlled, that is more chronic in nature, can lead to a whole bunch of different diseases. That includes cardiovascular disease or inflammatory bowel disease, but it also connects to our brain, like Alzheimer's disease and Parkinson's. And so we read through, the media all the time that there's things that maybe we can improve, like our diet, trying to achieve more of a balanced and regulated immune response, because diet can drive our immune responses both directly and indirectly. So there's a whole bunch of things that can influence our immune system. And I already mentioned, well, diet is definitely one of them. But there's other things too. For example, environmental toxins, which may or may not be associated with our food or water. For example, microplastics are kind of getting press, right? Where we are all exposed to tons of microplastics that come into our mucosal surfaces orally through our water or through our food. Other things are our behaviors or our propensity to do physical exercise, for example. If we take medication, that most certainly can influence both directly and indirectly our immune responses. But one of the things that I would say over the last 15 years, we've really come to appreciate that really has a very intimate relationship with our immune response is this thing called the microbiome. And so the microbiome really is just this massive collection, as Deanna mentioned already, trillions of microorganisms. Like, to fathom how much that is, it's hard to understand, but the reality is that that's a whole lot of genetic material, much, much more than our own genome, in fact, makes up. And the microbiome is this collection of microorganisms. We often think about bacteria, but there's a lot more than bacteria. Bacteria is enormous. Yes, it's a major player in there, but what we haven't appreciated from literature yet or from research yet is that there's a whole ton of viruses there, right? There's also protists there. There's fungal communities there. So often we think about the bacteria, yes, and that's what we know the most about, but there are other microorganisms that are there for sure that are playing a major role. And we have this collection of microbes really at every mucosal surface, but we also have it at our skin, and pretty much you can find a microbiome to almost every site in the body at this point. The gut microbiome, though, is kind of special. And that's because it's probably the largest place of microorganisms. So there is the most microorganisms associated with this spot in the body, but also because it's open to whatever we put in our body, right? So whatever we eat, whatever we drink, it will hit eventually the gut microbiome. There's that potential for those things to come together and form this triad, right? So our food, the gut microbiome, and our immune responses from the host, so ourselves. And so we know a lot about the gut microbiome compared to other sites in the body. And we know that it is critical for development of immune responses, what we call tolerance in immunology. And tolerance is really just that we don't form an inappropriate immune response to that. So it's regulated in a way that is healthy for us. It is very much key to immunometabolic health There's a lot of evidence to support that. So not just in digestion, but the way that we respond to food, the way that we take in calories, the way that we store calories. And of course, it has the ability to signal to pretty much all the other organ systems, including the brain. So we can appreciate at this point in time that the gut microbiome is really a major player in health and disease. And it's gotten a lot of press about that. The reality is that we're still very, naive about how these things work. We can say that there's, good bacteria and there's bad bacteria, but the reality is it's not that black and white. It's context specific, right? So our ability to respond to those microbes really does matter. If there is a relationship that we are starting to unravel, and sometimes it can seem a little personal, right? So that your microbes might be different than my microbes and might be different than your kids' microbes. But we as humans are a lot more similar than, say, another entire animal species, right? So there are things to learn. But we know for sure, and I think the best evidence for sure is that the gut microbiota does play a role in your metabolism. So obesity, for example, it can play a role in how you respond to cancer treatment or even the development of cancer. And what we're starting to appreciate more and more now is that it has a major role in dementia, for example, and mental health and other psychiatric conditions. And I think, if I had said that 10 years ago, people would be like, what? What are you talking about? No way. But I think that there's quite a lot of evidence to support that these things are actually very well connected. And we're starting to understand why. So it's kind of the forefront of what's happening in research in this area. Now, we all live in the West, right? We're here in Vancouver in Canada. And what I can say is that the field has really studied mostly the West, right? I think 80% of the studies that we know about the microbiome really are on Westernized populations. And what we've learned from what a so-called Westernized gut microbiome does is that it doesn't service us, we are the host, in a way that promotes health. So if we were to say, okay, here's a healthy microbiome from healthy people, what we could say is that there is evidence to support that that's very important in, say, calorie storage or satiety. And it's very important in things like regulating inflammation. And we can say that it's important in psychological health. It is associated with certain behaviors. But mostly what the research has sort of told us, the story has unfolded, is that when it's westernized or industrialized, this is associated with a bunch of dysfunction, and that includes calorie storage, less satiety, a lack of vitamin production, for example, dysregulated inflammation that often doesn't shut down when it needs to and leads to damage. And there's a whole lot of work now suggesting that this psychological health is dysfunctional. And so while this is a very new and exciting area of research, I think it's safe to say there's a lot of studies that have sort of popularized this area because it is so fascinating. And, so you can find titles like, Are We Controlled by Microbes? Well, there is studies out there to suggest that our behaviors are decided by the types of microbes that we might or might not have. It can change brain function. And so it's become sort of this area of research that is very, very fascinating, which is how I found myself sort of going into this area, because it's something that you can't really ignore when you want to understand the gut microbiome and how it affects overall host health. And so a bunch of different real scientific pathways have led to us to sort of, accept that these relationships between the gut and the brain are real. So there's lots of studies out there to show that the gut microbiota might change or be associated with certain behaviors like mood and stress, anxiety, Alzheimer's, Parkinson's disease. Um, and so some of these pathways, and I recognize that this might just all look like gobbledygook, but there are pathways that specifically, promote our understanding of how these relationships are real. So there are lots of neurotransmitters, for example, in the gut. There are different metabolites produced by microbes or different antigens harbored by microbes that can affect neural communication through the enteric pathway that connects to the brain, for example. And so these things are being studied a lot, including in my group, to understand how these things are connected. So there are clinical implications through what we call this gut-brain axis, and really a more appropriate term is the gut microbiome and host brain axis or immune axis. But the pathways that are involved include the vagus nerve, the enteric nervous system, and cells that are specific to the endocrine system that can connect also to pancreas or the liver. And there are certain chemicals that have been discovered to be important for these this highway connecting the gut and the brain. There was a really interesting paper that just came out last week that showed this antigen called flagellin. It's like what the bacteria use to move, controls satiety or controls how full you might feel, how satisfied you might feel with food. So there's all these things that are helping us understand how this pathway is connected. So this is why I study the gut-brain pathway. It really was just something that landed into my lap because I was interested mostly in gut microbes, what the gut microbes did. And the most obvious thing to study was actually food or diet. And throughout my time in the lab, one of the things that me and a whole lot of other people globally realized was that diet was actually a pretty major predictor in the type of microbes that occupy the gut. This starts when you're a baby. So what does mom eat? What does mom feed you? And then eventually, even as an adult, food can play a role. And I started looking at various components of diet, not just dietary patterns and specific aspects of diet, but also what was associated with our food. So, for example, glyphosate is something that I stumbled upon because it is something that is present on our food in the West. What we do know, and what we can say from mine and other various labs, lots of other labs, is that when we have a disease-associated microbiome, this often leads to what I'd say is a derailment of our immune system. And so this could lead to various disease susceptibilities. And this is sort of what I was interested in and what I have been studying in my research lab. One of the things that popped up on my journey over the past while is that this one pathway seems particularly important in the gut-brain axis. And it really is just an amino acid, tryptophan. So we find that in our foods. And diet can contain tryptophan. And so this tryptophan metabolite can influence, or the tryptophan amino acid can influence all the various metabolites that seem to be very important in the gut-brain axis. For example, serotonin or kynurenine, and all of these neuropeptide signaling. And this was very interesting to me because we could associate this pathway with anxiety and depression, which is comorbid with the disease that I often study, inflammatory bowel disease. So that is chronic inflammation in the gut. And so that's how all these things sort of link together for me. One of the things I want to tell you about is I'm going to tell you two major stories today from my lab. And one of the ones is regarding a Mediterranean diet pattern. And we had studied both in rodents as well as in humans, and this is a particular in ulcerative colitis patients, that if we compared a Mediterranean diet pattern to the Canadian habitual diet pattern, we could see differences in not only the microbiome, but also their ability to maintain the remission from their disease. And if you look at these two pyramids, there are some key differences. And when we studied reductionistically in our lab, so in rodent models, what is actually a Western diet? We focused on the types of fats and fibers. So fibers not in the Western diet, and we focused on more of a seed oil rich lipid type. So omega-6 in the Western diet. And so I started to think about, well, would this actually influence, and this is a very data heavy slide, and I apologize for that. Most of them won't be. But what we wanted to understand was if the Western diet pattern could drive colitis in our mice, would that be associated with various behavior changes? And the answer is yes. And what we found was that the Mediterranean diet pattern actually returns long-term memory compared to the Western diet pattern. So this is all rodent work, but also improved risk-taking behaviors that could be associated with anxiety. And so we could show in our rodent models, which are model systems, that diet would influence our behavior and certainly was related to colitis. And so we looked at ulcerative colitis patients as well, and there's only so many things that you can do in a human, but our rodent study actually led us to do these dietary interventions. And our Mediterranean diet pattern was mostly rich in olive oil. It didn't avoid saturated fat, but it was, once in a week you can have red meat. We didn't say don't eat butter, so it did include dairy, but it also was very rich in fiber. And when we looked at ulcerative colitis patients, we understood that this was very well tolerated. So we say that this could be recommended as a remission diet to ulcerative colitis patients because we found various things that were very important. For example, we found that this inflammation-associated biomarker, fecal calprotectin, was reduced when the patients maintain a Mediterranean diet pattern for a 12-week period of time compared to the Canadian habitual diet cohort. And this was associated with decreased scores or the maintenance of disease activity. And we found this was associated with various microbes that seemed to be beneficial and a reduction in microbes that were often associated with inflammation. So this is important actually because if you know somebody with ulcerative colitis or IBD, historically, it was really told to avoid fat and to avoid fiber because this would actually exacerbate symptoms in the intestine. But the reality is that those types of diets weren't feeding the microbes in a way that was beneficial. And so that's why it was important we show that this could be very well tolerated. And it was a diet that people liked to take. So they were happier on our scores of happiness. But what's really going on there will lead to this next part of the story was that we found all these microbes that were changed, right? But who cares and what does that mean? Well, the who cares part comes from others who have done studies looking at what happens when we take a microbiome and we Westernize it. We end up actually losing, and this isn't a concept that was developed by Sonnenberg, so not me, but somebody else who's very big in the field. where they looked at the Hasta tribe. So this is sort of the last remaining hunting and gathering communities, but they have really, really fiber rich diets and just wild food, like zero process anything. And what they noticed is that these Hasta tribes, compared to a Western sort of microbiome, would have these things that were vanish or blossom taxa. So taxa means the microbe of interest. And what happens is the vanished taxa are lost in the industrial microbiome. And instead, it gets populated with what's called the blossom taxa. So the idea is that our westernization or our diets tend to make microbes extinct from our guts. And then the question really becomes, well, how can we get them back? Right? So for sure, diet is influencing the type of microbes we have. And now we've understood that as we industrialize our diets, that is associated with the loss of certain taxa that are present in microbiomes that are really not associated with much disease. So as I started to think about this, I was like, oh, is this really just a Mediterranean diet? Was that the only thing that was important? Like what about diet is actually important? And I started to think about really, it's probably just whole foods, right? Like what is industrialization actually? It's probably just the addition of foods that have a whole bunch of additives that we really barely know what do, alone or in combination. And so that processing, that industrialization of food is pretty much not present in the Mediterranean diet, right? Like when you think about the Mediterranean diet, it's just the incorporation of foods that are real. And that was similar to a traditional Asian diet, right? And that was similar to a traditional Indian diet. So, from my perspective, it was less likely to be the fact that it was a Mediterranean diet and more likely to be the fact that, our Western diet is more likely to include processed foods. And so, based on that sort of hypothesis, I wanted to follow the Indian gut. And I wanted to characterize the gut microbiome of healthy Indians, Indian immigrants, and Indo-Canadians. And the reason for that was because that particular population was really transitioning very, very rapidly from a very traditional diet to a more westernized diet. And so I did the study that I want to share with you today, and I'll come back to brain, I promise. And so what we found was that Indo-Canadians, so Canadians that were born here of Indian ancestry, exhibited this transitional gut microbiota that had the vanish and the blossom hypothesis associated with it. So similar to the Hasda tribe, the Indo-Canadians were more transitional. They were westernized compared to the Indians who lived in India or even the Indo immigrants that had migrated here first generation. And really, this has been published now. This just showed that it was probably most likely food associated with it, not necessarily environment. And one of the things that we looked at was ultra processed foods. And so ultra processed foods was really shocking to me. If you look at the Indian population, it's about 10% of their calories will come from processed foods. And you dig really deep, it's just mostly biscuits. So their food systems, while they are rapidly developing and changing, traditionally, or even like when I did the study 7 years ago, the ultra processed food intake was very, very low, but the Indo-Canadians there in the red were about 60%. And that is actually where our European Canadians and our European immigrants sat as well. So it was the ultra processed foods that are most likely significant drivers in the westernized microbiome. And if you're wondering what the heck that means, I've just put a graph here looking at ultra processed foods. So these are things that you find in packages, right? Whereas less processed foods are things that you will find on a tree, for example, like the apples or the nuts, or water. And so there are things in between as well. But this says, and there's a lot of press on this right now too, about the Mediterranean diet. But in my view, it's most likely just that the westernized diet is just full of garbage, quite frankly. And so what we could conclude was that the ultra processed diet was associated with this blossom taxa, and this was associated with people who were living in Canada who are also at risk of westernized diseases, for example, like inflammatory bowel disease. But the study helps us understand that as India goes through a rapid westernization, which it currently is, then we most likely will see disease rates start to increase that were traditionally associated with the West, and that includes inflammatory bowel disease. Now, the other thing that is uniquely Western is this thing called desiccation. And this will link back to gut brain. So desiccation is the process of applying chemicals to pulse and wheat crops pre-harvest with the effort to speed up uniform ripening of the crop. Common desiccant chemicals include this one called glyphosate. And this is something that I've been studying for the last few years. It's not just that desiccation is applied to our food crops, but it's also that it's applied to our forests too. And so it really does affect the food web. And there was this, one of my colleagues, Dr. Miranda Hart, who is an ecologist, she wrote this really cool article, if you want to connect to this and see. It's called Herbicide, What is for Dinner? And she was a part of the study where we looked at the effects of glyphosate on the microbiome and what that meant for the gut-brain axis. We don't think generally, or the EPA doesn't generally think that glyphosate is acutely toxic. And that's probably true. It's probably not acutely toxic, but it is toxic. And so the question becomes, why do we continue to spray our crops? And it is quite a controversial subject. There's no doubt about that, but I'm going to share with you what we learned in the study. So I just want to point out that this is uniquely Western, okay? So this process of spraying glyphosate or Roundup, which is the name, is somewhat associated with North America. You can see the pesticide use associates quite well with inflammatory bowel disease prevalence, diabetes prevalence, and a massive increase in mental health disorders. So our hypothesis in the lab is that these things are in fact connected. And we do have a study that shows mechanistically how these things happen. I'm not going to show you the data, but I'll tell you our conclusion. When we expose glyphosate in drinking water to mice, and they give birth to their babies, and then those babies give birth. So we have the babies, and then we have the grandbabies, if you will. So F1 and F2. There is this transgenerational effect of glyphosate on the microbiome that changes in the ancestors or in the progeny metabolic dysfunction. For example, glucose clearance is altered. There's also a GLP-1 decrease. So GLP-1 tanks and an increase in insulin resistance. GLP-1 is important. You probably have all heard of Ozempic at this point. And so lots of people are taking Ozempic to control their diabetes or to control their satiety. And GLP-1 tanks in the mice when glyphosate is exposed. So that's an important observation to make. We also show that there is a microcolitis, so not overt colitis, But there are signs that colitis is coming. For example, a decrease in goblet cells, an increase in inflammation and cytokines, and certainly a change in the microbiome. But most importantly for today, this is associated with behavioral outcomes that include a decrease in working memory and a decrease in locomotion, which we associated with a molecule called alpha-synuclein, which is an important molecule in Parkinson's disease. So there's not an acute toxicity per se, but it happens over generations, compounding with dose as well as with progeny. And we connected specific microbes to various hormones. For example, Akkermansia muciniphila was associated positively with the production of GLP-1. And the glyphosate reduced both of these. And other microbes were associated with kynurenine, which are a part of the tryptophan pathway that connects the gut and the brain. So prenatal glyphosate exposure impacts the gut-brain metabolite associations. And so there's a lot more to find there, but these are some of the studies that we're working on right now in our lab. What I really want to point out is that just fundamentally, this is actually really huge conceptually. Because if we're spraying glyphosate, which again is a uniquely Western thing, we're not only spraying it on our food crops, it's also being sprayed in our forests. That's affecting our food web. And we only started doing this in my generation, Generation X. And so my generation didn't really feel the effects of this yet. If we believe my study, which was taking place in rodents and looking at the generational effects, it'll be the millennials that first start to experience this, like the F1 in our rodent study. And then Generation Z, which is the F2, right, in our study. And notably, there's a projected 700% increase in mental health disorders in this generation. And I guess I posit the question, are these things actually related? And so more food for thought, certainly more work to be done there to understand this. I want to leave you with the idea that poor gut health, whatever it's caused by, our Western diet, glyphosate exposure, other food toxins, our terrible dietary choices with ultra-processed foods, they may be the root cause of mental illness. And this is because there is direct and indirect pathways that sort of form a highway between the gut and the brain. And so the question is can we solve these problems? And that's actually where my company came in, which I'm not going to discuss today due to time, but certainly happy to answer any questions that anyone might have regarding this. Certainly, we know it's related to food intake, like the Mediterranean diet and the Indian diet, or just diets that are lacking processed foods. So with that, I want to thank everybody in my research lab, all of my collaborators, and if you ever get the opportunity to visit this campus in the Okanagan, please do. It's very beautiful. Thank you very much.
Wonderful. Thank you so much for that amazing presentation. Everyone can hear me, correct?
Yes.
Oh,
I can, yeah.
thank you so much. Yeah, let's take a moment here to ask a few of these questions in the chat. Quite interesting here. So I'll start off with the first one from Pat, asking what % of oral probiotics make it through the stomach to the intestine?
Well, that's a great question. Very few. From my own studies, like very, very few, right? So like probably 95% of it is killed. The question really becomes this, and this is the basis of my company, is if you have a chronic disease and you have inflammation in the intestine, which many chronic diseases have, right? So for example, Parkinson's disease has some level of chronic inflammation in the gut. Alzheimer's disease. So not just acute, like not just inflammatory bowel disease, but many diseases. then inflammation is designed to kill beneficial microbes, are sort of a product of that. It's designed to kill infectious pathogens, actually. But what happens is many infectious pathogens are really good at resisting and tolerating inflammation. And so they get past, right? But beneficial microbes aren't necessarily. And so the basis of my company is actually finding or genetically modifying microbes that are good and have good gut health to actually resist that inflammation. And so the question is even if it survived the stomach acid, which it can if it's manufactured properly in a capsule, for example, and not all capsules are created equally. And so I will say that viability is a major issue in the field. But even if it could, then the question is does it land? Does it stick? Does it colonize to do its job? Right? And so that's another factor.
Thank you. To move on to Elizabeth, is there any data or information on how illness such as diverculitis affect the microbiome? Also gallbladder disease or having the gallbladder removed?
Those are really great questions. Diverticulitis, for sure, is an inflammatory condition. It's like pockets, physiological pockets form in the intestine that become very, very painful because things can get caught in there. And for sure, it has to do with the gut microbiome. Like the biggest evidence for that, right, is that if you take an antibiotic, you can actually alleviate a lot of those symptoms. But to be honest, not enough studies are done in diverticulitis to really understand those relationships. But for sure, those things are involved, no doubt. And then the other question was about the gallbladder. That's a really, really great question. Um, I honestly haven't seen any studies looking specifically at people who have no gallbladder compared to people who still have their gallbladders. Of course, your digestion processes are very changed, and because of the influx of bile that comes in when you eat, and there's nowhere to store it when you don't have a gallbladder, certainly this changes the gut microbiome composition, but we don't really appreciate like the effect that this has on people quite yet. But it's a fantastic question that deserves some more attention.
Thank you. Another question here from Heather. Is sinusitis, I'm thinking that's what I'm reading here, at all related to ulcerative colitis?
So sinus, like sinuses, is that what you said?
Like,
Uh,
that's what I'm sinus.
yeah, that is not a relationship that I have seen too much data on. Although there's you in Vancouver, there's a great microbiome person who studies this. But I honestly don't know the connection with ulcerative colitis, but it wouldn't surprise me if it was.
Okay.
Just
And
because there's all these extraintestinal inflammation associated disorders with IBD. Just that's why. Yeah, sorry.
no, of course. And then another question, does Western mean North American? Because Mediterranean is west of Asia, isn't it?
Yeah,
Or does it
that's
mean-
fair. Yeah, so the concept of westernization, the term, is associated with North America, but also many European countries. So, and that gets a little confusing, right? Because there's also Mediterranean, and Europe is like really vast, but most often associated with North America. So Canada, as well as the United States, and mostly the UK. And that's where the term sort of associates itself with. Yeah. Not necessarily accurate in description. Agreed.
good clarification. And then, oh, great question. Just because I relate to this one, I have celiac disease. So somebody asked Karen here, how does this impact celiac disease? I know that the inflammation in the gut is an ongoing issue.
Yeah, so celiac disease is is really a very specific immune response, autoimmune response to gluten. And so that's like really, really specific. You could say, well, let's just remove gluten from our diet, easier said than done. But for sure, there's a lot of great research coming out of McMaster to show that it's much more than that, right? It's not just that. You can't just remove gluten and then be completely free of celiac disease. So there is an association, for example, with the gut microbiota, like for sure, do you have the right microbes? And if you don't have the right microbes, this can influence outcomes, but also other inflammatory pathways. Now, what's really curious, right, is that one of the things that I thought about when we did this glyphosate study was I knew that there was these observations where if you removed all the gluten from particular blinded diets, there would still be a propensity for celiac patients to react. And so the question is like, well, is that just because there's still gluten there? Or was it bigger, right? Did it actually have to do with glyphosate associated with crops like wheat, right? And so I don't actually have the answers to that, but I feel like there's people who, at least stories of people who have celiac disease when they live in Canada, but when they go and eat bread in France, which by the way bans glyphosate spraying, they're totally fine to eat gluten there, right? So I think there's lots of more questions than there are answers to that in particular, but it's a really great question.
Wow, thank you. That's so interesting. And I'm just curious for myself as well. Have you seen any correlation in an uprise of celiac disease, and that being connected to anything agriculturally? Just because, as you mentioned, like glyphosate. Just curious in your research.
I personally don't know that answer. If there were answers to be found, I would look to McMaster. A lady named Dr. Elena Verdu has some really great studies and really great literature on celiac disease.
You. And then ulcerative colitis and Crohn's are autoimmune condition. How can an animal model incorporate this aspect?
Yeah, so autoimmune condition that involves, say, specific antibodies that attack cell surfaces, like are pretty well defined, right? And Crohn's disease and ulcerative colitis are mostly involved, like not necessarily the antibody responses. There's some evidence to say that there's antibody responses that are important, but it's mostly like a chronic inflammation that is dysregulated. So yes, still considered autoimmune because we're attacking our own, immune cells, but we're attacking our own structures in our guts. Also, maybe we're attacking our own microbiota. But how rodent studies reflect this is let's all accept that rodent studies are flawed. Okay, like I recently found out that 9 out of 10 drugs that are developed in rodents actually fail in humans. That's really substantial. But rodents also play a major role in sort of understanding, especially the immune system. Like we're not that different, right? Like even when we consider the immunology textbook, like 80% of what we know is actually totally formed from a human, and it stands out. Like we can't do certain things in humans, right? So for sure, the rodent models in colitis are flawed, and there are even fewer in Crohn's disease, and they're all flawed, right, in one way or another. So the way that researchers get around this is that they incorporate multiple models, right? So for example, in my work, we look at acute models using a chemical, which isn't realistic at all. Yet, most of the drugs that are approved for IBD, for example, uses this chemical model. So, there's some success attached to that. But still, that's not good enough. So then I look at other models that are more chronic in nature. So we have deleted out a particular molecule called mucin 2, and that allows the rodent to develop spontaneous colitis over time. And they will all get colitis. It gives us the ability, for example, to do a dietary intervention that looks a lot more like what happens in an ulcerative colitis patient. Um, And even, that might not be good enough. And so sometimes, and even, my company went into pigs, for example, right? Because that's a lot closer to the physiology of the human. Um, and so there is a place for rodent research, but we have to be really creative and be very, very careful so that we don't completely extrapolate what we see, in human. And that's why I like to do all sorts of models as well as humans. And that's what's called translational science, right? Is to try to understand it from rodent, from our bench, then all the way to the human, knowing that there's caveats on both sides.
Beautifully answered. Another question from Maya. If it's primarily diet-based, how do you explain siblings who eat the same things and one develops IBD while the others don't?
Yeah, I wouldn't say that it is 100% diet-based. I think diet is a major factor, but for example, my own personal belief is that diet isn't going to cure IBD. Like if you have a genetic susceptibility to IBD and something triggers it, it could be diet, that's going to happen. But diet is a tool in which you could control your symptoms. It doesn't mean your disease would disappear. And so, unfortunately, for some siblings, right, they're not genetically identical in this, they're twins. But even in that case, they could have different developmental pathways that expose them to different microbes over time, too, right? And diet certainly influences that, certainly can help manage the symptoms of that disease, maybe plays a role in the risk of that disease, right? But it isn't the only factor. And that's the thing about many of these chronic inflammatory conditions is they're very, very complex and multifactorial, right? So it's kind of like a perfect storm that happens in any one individual.
Awesome. Ruby asks, how does one increase the level of positive microbiome when living in the West with contaminated flours, etc., with glycophosphate?
Yeah, it's a really, really great question. And I think I certainly don't have the answers, but I guess in an ideal world, right? Because we don't all just get to move to an island and like eat non-processed everything. It's not realistic for where we are. And it feels really helpless that we don't have control over policies. The thing that I'm trying to do is personally understand it so that policies could be changed, right? And so I'm working on a project now with First Nations and environmental scientists, and we're connecting this food web to gut health. And we have lawyers on our team, and we really hope that with all of these major players, we could influence policy. So ideally, it would be really great if we could find a solution and not spray with Roundup like our entire ecosystem, right? But what can you do is I can say this. I have looked at, for example, lentils that have been sprayed or not sprayed. And it seems to me that glyphosate could still be associated with even organic. Sometimes it's not, so that's cool. So I don't want to say to you, go and all buy organic because that's not necessarily going to solve the problem. What's going to solve the problem is actually people like you saying that you're not going to buy certain things or you want policy changes that happen from an evidence-based point of view. And it takes time, but that's my job is to provide evidence, right, to move forward on that pathway. I don't think that you can entirely avoid that right now in our food system, honestly. And that's a really sad thing to say. But I think the one choice that you have, the one power that you have is to not eat things that are mostly from Costco, right? Like not just because they're American, but because it's mostly processed. So you do have control over that. It's not to say, though, that even non-processed foods aren't going to have that level of glyphosate exposure. I know that if you rinse it at least 3 times, like we take our lentils and we rinse it with water at least 3 times, you do reduce that, not completely eliminate it. I guess it's just having sort of that awareness and do the best that you can, right? Until we have fundamental policy changes.
Thank you. We're coming close to the end here. I may ask one last question, and unfortunately, we can't get to all questions, but we will be uploading the recording as well, and that will be on the website in about 2 weeks time. So just to review any other questions that have been answered. But I'll end off with this one question here. The other rampant health issue I'm aware of is fatty liver disease. What impacts could this condition have on attempts to heal the gut?
Yeah, that's a really great question. Um, Metabolically, we're not doing so well in the West, whatever we call the West in North America. And fatty liver is associated with that. And honestly, intuitively we go, well, we should just stop eating fat. But there's actually quite a lot of evidence to support that's not necessarily the case, that maybe it's the type of fat that we're consuming instead. And there's a lot of confusion around this. And so I mean, as you attempt to improve your fatty liver with dietary choices and such, I would assume that this would also resolve the gut, or that the gut resolution is associated with the resolution of your fatty liver. Like, there's no doubt that these things are actually connected. But how you do that, I don't know yet. For sure, people will say that it's related to diet. There's a lot of really cool work showing that somehow a ketogenic diet could improve that, or somehow fasting could improve that. But I don't think we know for sure yet. And the evidence is really just living here, right? A lot of people have metabolic disease, including fatty liver. No doubt it's related to some of the messiness of our dietary systems, whether that's through choice, like you choose to eat, a chocolate bar versus an apple, or just the fact that we have these things implemented in our foods, like, for example, glyphosate.
Oh, wonderful. And yeah, we are at time here. So thank you so much, Dr. Gibson, for speaking on how interconnected our guts are with the rest of our body. So important, and such amazing engagement from you all. Thank you, and have a lovely rest of your week. Please feel free to log off here now, and have a great
Thank
day.
you so much. Take care. Bye.
Bye.